The Glasgow Herald on July 4, 1883, started a lengthy account with the following statement. Quote, "The list of appalling disasters, which have recently shocked the public mind, received yesterday a lamentable addition by the sinking of a vessel in the Clyde while in course of launching. The catastrophe was as sudden as it was unexpected, and has proved to be unspeakably sad in its results."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Daphne never set sail.
Here we are. Enjoy!
There was nothing to make the launching of the Daphne stand out among the many ships that were launched on the Clyde River. For the general public in the area, the launching of ships was a matter of routine. There was also nothing of particular interest about the ship they were launching. The Daphne was a small 590-ton screw steamer that was being built for the Glasgow and Londonderry Steam Company. She was intended for the transportation of cattle around Ireland, and was specifically built with that in mind. The only thing that made the ship any different than any of the other ships that the Alexander Stephen & Sons shipyard produced regularly was the speed with which the people who had ordered the ship wanted the work completed. This did mean a few adjustments leading up to the launch. For one thing, while the propeller and shafts were in place, the engines and boilers were not. The yard in which the ship was being built did not have a crane, so it was customary for the boiler to be added later by being lowered into the ship. That the engine was missing was far less common. This in turn meant that the deck was not yet completed on the starboard side of the ship, so that they would be able to lower the boiler in place with a crane after the launch. As they prepared to launch the Daphne, there were piles of what was to eventually be decking piled on the deck, as well as in the holds of the ship. There was also an unusually large number of men working on the Daphne, even on the day of her launch. It was not unusual for shipyards to have men working on the ship through the launch. It was a matter of efficiency, but it was later estimated that there were up to 200 men and boys on the Daphne as she traveled down the ways. A larger number than normal, as a response to the tight timetable the task of building the ship was on. This included many men who were employed as outside contractors who were not accounted for on the books of the shipyard. Officially on the books of the shipyard, only about 120 men were employed on the Daphne that day. But it would soon be found just how inaccurate this number was. It was hoped to have her completed and at work before the fair holidays, which was the opening of the busy season in the cattle trade. It was decided to launch the Daphne on the 3rd of July, 1883, at 11:30 in the morning. No matter how often ships were launched on the Clyde, it was still a matter of excitement, and it was admitted that not only did a crowd come out to watch from the surrounding area, but also frequently workers would find an excuse to be on a ship that was about to launch. Not only that, but sometimes they snuck their friends on. The launching of a ship was not a small matter, after all, with the ship hitting the water and the crowd cheering. There was a slight delay in this launch. She was not christened until 5 minutes before noon, and the Daphne began to smoothly glide down the ways. The crowd, accustomed to such occasions being an uneventful time of celebration, let out cheers as the ship headed toward the water, already anticipating her successful launch. 2 chains slowed her descent down the ways, these, too, being customary, and carefully placed, to not only slow her down so that she would not hit the water with dangerous speeds, but also to control her drift against the strong currents of the Clyde before she could get stable once she had been launched. 1 chain was attached to the starboard side of her hull, and the other to the port stern of the ship. Everyone agreed that the Daphne's descent towards the water had not been faster or slower than any other ship's, and a later inspection would assure everyone that her hull had not been damaged in the process. As the ship was launched, some of the men stayed at their work, but others abandoned their posts and made their way up to the deck to watch the dramatic moment when the ship would first hit the water. Almost as soon as the ship was out into the river, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Ships often rocked and turned a bit on launch, so there was nothing alarming in that, and the chains were serving their purpose in swinging the ship into the position that was wanted. But it was clear to everyone, both on the ship and on shore, that the ship was listing to port. The ship listed to port first immediately on hitting the water, but then entirely righted herself, only to list to port again. For a moment, the ship seemed to correct itself once more. The port side decking was touching the water for a second, but then the ship seemed to swing slightly back up. On board the Daphne, the first lunge of the ship to port had thrown the men on board to the port side of the ship, along with the piles of loose plates and timbers that had been placed on the deck of the Daphne to complete the ship after launch. Henry O'Farrell, a riveter, was on deck when the ship began to dip to port side. He ran to the wheel that controlled the ship's anchor, hoping to counter the list with the anchor. He managed to turn the wheel twice before it was torn from his hands and he was thrown headfirst against the railing of the ship. All around him, planks came crashing, inflicting terrible injuries on some of the other men who had been standing on the deck. Henry O'Farrell, knowing that it was his only chance, threw himself into the water to escape the ship. The ship once again plunged port side down, and with almost no warning at all, it sank beneath the Clyde. The water rushed through the hole in the decking that had been left to put the boilers in, cascading into the parts of the ship where the men had still been working below decks. In the engine room, Alex Crummond was working when the ship suddenly tilted. Many of the men who were working in the engine room were thrown against the metal bulkheads and stunned or injured when the ship violently listed. Then the water came roaring down on top of them. Alex Crummond shouted a warning to the men who had been working with him, and then started to pull himself up one of the ladders against the force of the rushing water. He managed to reach the deck just before the ship went down. He would be one of the very few who would escape from below deck. Another who escaped was a joiner named James McLean, who had been working on one of the skylights. He had been working for 5 hours by the time the ship's launch came, but he had a strange premonition something was going to go wrong. The entire time he was working, he made sure that a piece of wood was near him to use for flotation, just in case. The wood was ripped away from him in the sinking of the ship, but he still managed to reach the river bank by swimming. For the people on the shore, where they had seen a ship only a minute ago, there was now just a mass of struggling men in the water, a huge amount of air bubbles, and some floating wreckage. This was particularly horrifying, since many of the people who had come to watch the launch had family or friends who had been working on the ship. There was no shortage of boats and ships nearby to come to rescue the people in the water, but these too offered their own dangers. The tug the Hotspur, which had been employed to help with the launch of the Daphne, came rushing to the rescue at top speed, only to hit one of the launches that was also heading to save people. It turned the launch into splinters in moments with its paddle wheels, and then plowed into a group of swimming survivors, injuring many men and causing the loss of 3. After that, it was decided to keep the tugs at a distance and do all of the rescue work in small boats. With the water full of men as it was too dangerous to have ships with paddle wheels traveling through the area. All around the area, men from various shipyards jumped into launches and dinghies and threw themselves into the rescue effort. It would take a very long time for the total loss of the disaster to be known, and those who had been saved to come forward. To the frustration of the authorities, the people who were saved for the most part simply went home. So, when they tried to account for who had been lost and who had been saved, it was more difficult than anyone could have imagined. It was only as friends and family began to come forward to ask if the remains of people they had known had been recovered that a better picture of the total number of people who had been on the Daphne came into focus. In the end, it was decided that about 75 people had been saved, with at least 124 people lost, with many of the people who had been lost still trapped in the hull of the sunken Daphne. Through the night of the 3rd, even with the effort switching from rescue to recovery, people worked through the night on the river with hooks, trying to find anyone they could by the light of lanterns that had been hung from the shipyard cranes to light up the water. The effort would continue for 2 weeks under the watchful eyes of the people who had lost someone as well as people who came to watch out of curiosity after hearing about the tragedy. The crowd was particularly large the weekend after the failed launch. It was the start of the Glasgow Fair, which brought large crowds into the area. The fair holidays had begun, and the Daphne was definitely not going to be handed over to the people who had ordered her before they ended. That was not to say that the Daphne was to remain at the bottom of the Clyde. After 2 weeks, 89 people had been recovered. During low tide, part of the ship was exposed, and divers were able to feel their way through hatches. This was eventually abandoned, however, as too dangerous for the divers. The water was dark and polluted. Just like many rivers at the time, the Clyde was full of sewage and industrial waste. The divers were still used to complete the dangerous work of sealing the hatches of the ship, fighting against the strong currents of the Clyde, while a salvage vessel moved into place and was able to get her pumps to work. On the 19th of July, the ship was finally raised, and they were able to retrieve the final people who had been trapped in the hold. Public interest was at a peak at this point. This was even more the case because not long before the launch of the Daphne, a ship named Harmonia had also listed at a dangerous angle while being launched on the Clyde. While it was true the Harmonia had not fully capsized, unlike the Daphne, and no lives had been lost, people were starting to question if the Harmonia was a warning sign that should have been listened to before matters ended in tragedy. A fund was started for the families of the dependents of those who had been lost. Queen Victoria sent a telegram of sympathy and £100 to the fund. Though by Scottish law, the inquiry into the loss of the Daphne should have been a private matter, it was opened to the public, and, due to the strong public interest, Sir Edward James Reed, the well-known naval architect, was brought in to do a complete investigation and head the inquiry. There would be some arguments that were later decided to be red herrings over the course of the hearings, which stretched on for over a month. It was argued that the fault lay in the strong current, but it was pointed out that the strong current was always present, and yet a ship capsizing on launch was an extremely rare occurrence. There was fault found with how the drag chains had been attached, but Sir Reed responded that if they had been placed any differently, he would have blamed them for the ship capsizing, but they had been placed according to years of experience, and, if anything, had fought against the ship tilting to port as it had. The shipyard representative argued that they had not dangerously rushed the building of the Daphne at all, and dismissed the idea that the fault lay with the empty hold, the lack of heavy machinery to balance the ship, or her loaded decks. This was undermined when his manager testified that they very rarely launched ships without engines, and that a larger number of men than normal had been on the ship as it was launched due to the large hurry they were in to complete the ship. The Glasgow and Londonderry Steam Packet Company also admitted that they had been putting pressure on the shipyard to quickly complete the ship, and had offered them a large bonus if they did. In the end, Sir Reed and the inquiry declared that the shipbuilders had not been guilty of grave neglect, but did say that they were guilty of a serious lack of judgment that had caused their ship to be top-heavy. Sir Reed pointed to the fact that many ships were being launched commercially that required ballast, cargo, or coal on board to have any stability, and that no one had considered the danger of launching ships of this sort even when ships were launched without any ballast of coal in their holds. It was also not the practice of the people designing the boats for commercial yards to do stability calculations before launch, even though it was the practice for government vessels, something that Reed was familiar with since he did government contracts. The person who had designed the Daphne had not even known how to do stability calculations, leading Sir Reed to dedicate the second half of his official published report to them. It was also stated that there was no reason to keep men working on the ship during launch, except for those who were needed for the launch itself. The practice was called needlessly dangerous, and only added to the top-heavy nature of the ship. With a single ship, the practice of launching ships across the United Kingdom, and especially on the River Clyde, changed entirely, as shipbuilders took the statements of the inquiry to heart. Gone were the days of large crowds of men on decks as the ships were launched, and stability calculations with careful knowledge of the weight on board became a standard practice before a ship was launched. The Daphne was repaired and renamed the Rose, still under the ownership of the Glasgow and Londonderry Steam Packet Company. When the Rose ran aground on the Firth of Clyde, the owners decided they were done with the unlucky ship, however, and sold her. She was refloated and sold to a company that placed her in the Mediterranean under the name of Ianthe. Ever the unlucky ship, the Ianthe would also run aground. In 1923, a ship named the Eleni, originally named the Daphne, was scrapped. The ship was gone for good, but the lessons that had been learned were now just considered common sense in the shipbuilding industry.
For the full report of Sir Edward James Reed on the loss of the Daphne, please see Report on the Daphne Disaster published 1883, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.